May 23rd, 2026. These are the most important stories since yesterday. In governance, as we covered yesterday, the White House scrapped a draft AI safety testing order hours before signing it. It was revealed yesterday as well that Musk and Zuckerberg were among those who called the president and lobbied against it. The text of the order is circulating and shows the framework was already fully voluntary. In AI, the NTSB took its entire public record system offline for the first time in agency history after AI tools reconstructed dead pilots' voices from publicly available crash investigation documents. Also in AI, DeepMind CEO Demis Hassabis told Google I/O that AI stands at the foothills of the Singularity, while OpenAI posted a $445,000 safety role explicitly focused on recursive self-improvement. In labor, Standard Chartered's CEO apologized after calling 7,800 employees displaced by AI-driven cuts lower-value human capital. In infrastructure, Iran is reportedly weighing a seizure of all 7 undersea cables crossing the Strait of Hormuz, the cables that carry Gulf AI infrastructure connectivity to Europe and the United States. In governance, Palantir's UK chief accused London Mayor Sadiq Khan of putting politics above public safety after Khan vetoed the company's £50 million contract with the Met Police, as we covered yesterday. In labor, Samsung memory chip workers secured an average annual bonus of $340,000 as AI-driven semiconductor demand pushes labor compensation to new heights across the chip sector. In tech, Expedia is building a marketing function aimed at AI agents rather than humans, betting that autonomous systems reason through every option on their own and no longer defer to brand recognition. Deeper dives on all of this are in today's Century Report, and many are discussed further in today's podcast. Links to both are in the description, or head over to thecenturyreport.com. Or if you're already here on the podcast, let's get into it now. The numbers in the Samsung deal are huge, the kind that takes more than one read. The company's memory chip workers, the people physically fabricating the chips that go into the AI training racks at Google, at OpenAI, at Anthropic, and at Meta, just secured average annual bonuses of $340,000 to call off an 18-day strike. That's average of $340,000 on top of their base salary. Under the deal, all chip workers get 50% of their annual salary as a regular cash bonus. Samsung sets aside 10.5% of its annual semiconductor operating profits for stock-based bonuses across the division. 60% of that stock pool flows to the memory chip unit, the workforce making the high-bandwidth memory chips that AI training depends on. A worker on a base salary of around $50,000 is now eligible for a total bonus of roughly $416,000. That's roughly 9 times base salary in a single year in compensation. So let's put this in context of where Samsung is right now. The company recently crossed $1 trillion valuation. Its last earning report showed profits up 8-fold, almost entirely from memory chip sales. South Korea exports about a quarter of its national output through Samsung alone. The figure being paid out to these workers is what a sliver of the AI build-out looks like when it reaches the labor market for the people who actually make the silicon. And there's a labor story on the other side of today's news too, though. Standard Chartered cutting about 7,800 back-office workers, and the CEO describing those workers as lower-value human capital. We'll get into that in detail later, but for now, hold the contrast in your mind. The chip workers building the physical substrate of AI are being paid a premium because they're scarce. There are only so many people on Earth who can run a memory fab at the leading process node. The bank workers doing operations on top of AI are being told they cost too much. The same wave is repricing both sides of the labor market in opposite directions and in the same week. So what this means for how you might think about your own work over the next several years, whether your role sits upstream or downstream of the AI infrastructure stack, is becoming a compensation question, not just a job description question. The Samsung deal makes that gradient legible at scale for the first time. And one more piece of context. The May 18th edition of the Century Report traced how 11 weeks of the Strait of Hormuz disruption surfaced as helium and LNG cost shocks inside TSMC, Samsung, and SK Hynix Q1 earnings. The supply chain repriced. Now the labor market underneath that supply chain is repricing too. All right, shifting away, new story here. In 1990, after a TV station aired the final cockpit exchanges from a Delta crash at Dallas-Fort Worth, federal law was changed to bar the public release of cockpit voice recordings. The pilots' union pushed for the protection and Congress agreed. The audio itself stayed sealed. But there was a workaround. Investigators could include spectrograms in public dockets. A spectrogram is a visual representation of audio frequency over time. It looks like a colored heat map. The protection rested on a technical assumption. Converting that picture back into audible voice was understood to be impractical. The image was safe to release because nobody could reverse the conversion. Internet sleuths, working with AI tools including OpenAI's Codex, just did exactly that, using materials from the ongoing investigation of UPS Flight 2976, which killed 3 crew and 12 people on the ground in Louisville last November. The NTSB's response? The agency took its entire online docket system offline, for the first time in its history. The official statement directly acknowledges that, quote, advances in image recognition and computational methods, close that quote, have enabled approximations of cockpit voice recorder audio from imagery the agency itself released. That is an institution naming on the record that the technical assumption underneath a 35-year-old protection framework is gone. And rather than defend the obsolete frame, the agency paused the public access while it figures out the next version. What's exposed by that pause is bigger than the NTSB, though. Every federal agency sitting on redacted filings, sealed FOIA audio annexes, court records with audio behind text orders. They're all running on the same pre-AI threat model. They published technical materials assuming the encoded information inside couldn't be retrieved without a specialized pipeline. That assumption has been carrying the weight of the public records architecture across the federal government, and it has now been publicly conceded by the agency that conceded first. The families of the UPS crew and the people on the ground in Louisville are caught in this. They spent the months since November working through the law that protected the audio while permitting the spectrograms. A generation of forensic records, every NTSB investigation that used spectrograms in the past 3 decades is now sitting in a different threat environment than the one in which it was published. If you've ever filed a public records request or relied on the assumption that information released by federal agencies is information they're actually choosing to release, then what shifted is that the technical floor underneath that whole architecture is being re-examined. The NTSB went first. The acknowledgement costs less when an institution runs it voluntarily than when a contested release forces it. The next agency considering the same concession will pay a smaller price because the NTSB already paid the first and the bigger one. A deeper look at this is in today's Century Report if you want to check it out. Shifting away again here. Within the same news cycle, DeepMind CEO Demis Hassabis told a Google I/O audience that the field stands at the foothills of the Singularity. And OpenAI posted a preparedness team job listing that names the work it's hiring against very directly. The phrase in the listing, quote, support preparations for recursive self-improvement, close the quote there. The salary band is from $295,000 to $445,000. The role is really concrete. The researcher will defend training pipelines against data poisoning, build tools to interpret model reasoning, measure how much of OpenAI's own technical work is being automated by the company's own coding tools. I want you to really notice something about the framing of the job. Hiring against a threshold is structurally different from researching whether the threshold actually exists. The preparedness team had been studying frontier risks for years. This is the first publicly visible position that is scoped specifically to the world in which AI systems train better versions of themselves. The salary prices the work as foundational. Hassabis' keynote prices the trajectory as operational. 2 of the leading frontier labs are now using language about recursive self-improvement in earnings calls and keynote slides, not in safety papers and speculative essays where this kind of language used to live. So let's be really precise about what this is and what it isn't. OpenAI isn't claiming recursive self-improvement is happening this quarter. The hiring is the answer to a different question. What does the safety architecture look like when the system being made safer is one that may eventually participate in its own improvement? The work begins now because the people doing it will need to know the systems intimately before that threshold actually arrives. A couple of weeks ago, Anthropic's Jack Clark put the odds of recursive AI self-improvement before the end of 2028 at 60%. Today's evidence makes that estimate operational. The capability is being prepared for inside the org charts of the companies building it. METR's autonomous task completion horizon went from 30 seconds to 12 hours in just 4 years. SWE bench from 2% to 93.9%. Anthropic's internal training code optimization benchmark moved more than 18-fold in under a year. The hiring is the institutional posture that those numbers produce when you actually take them seriously. If you work anywhere near software, AI, or technical research, what's being institutionalized is the assumption that within the working career of someone hired today, the system they're hired to make safer will be participating in its own improvement loop. That is a planning horizon, not a forecast. The trajectory is very visible. The labs building these systems are budgeting and staffing for it as a near-term operational reality. Shifting away again here, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have spent the past 2 years building the largest sovereign AI compute deployment outside the US-China axis. Stargate Abu Dhabi, the G42 Cerebras 8 exaflop deployment, Gulf positioning as a sovereign compute exporter to Europe and Africa, tens of billions of dollars in physical infrastructure on the ground. The compute is only commercially viable if the data can leave the country, and the data leaves through undersea fiber, and that undersea fiber, for the Gulf, transits the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz. Specifically, 7 cables move through the strait, carrying the bulk of the Gulf connectivity to Europe and to the United States. Iran is reportedly considering taking control of all 7. Undersea cables carry roughly 95% of international internet traffic. Hyperscalers running transatlantic and trans-Pacific routes typically require 4 or 5 physically separate network paths to minimize the disruption risk. The Gulf compute build-out has been operating on a much thinner concentration of routes than the standard would suggest, a single choke point that until this week's reporting wasn't priced into the planning documents at all. And as the Century Report has covered before, the silicon supply chain through this same strait already showed up as helium and LNG cost shocks inside TSMC, Samsung, and SK Hynix Q1 earnings 11 weeks ago. The data layer is now visible from a different angle. The response is already forming. Gulf landing stations connected through terrestrial fiber across Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Oman. New subsea terrestrial routes bypassing the choke points at Bab el Mandab and northern overland corridors through Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Terrestrial fiber can carry up to 144 fiber pairs per route versus only 24 for typical subsea, and that's 6 times the capacity. Though above-ground cables do come, of course, with their own vulnerabilities. A route through Damascus was severed just months after launch when the Syrian civil war reached it, for example. The economics here are the part that we really need to focus on. The diversification investments that easy connectivity geography had let everyone defer to now reads as the cheaper option on its own commercial terms because the proximate threat has had to materialize for the math to show it. Every Gulf data center contract being negotiated this quarter now carries the cable concentration question in a way that it didn't carry it last quarter. That's the reality of this war. The threat becoming legible in the press is the lower cost version of learning that lesson. So if you have money in some pension fund or an index fund, and many of us do, some portion of that capital is now exposed to the Gulf AI infrastructure build-out through the private credit channels that are funding it. The geographic concentration that wasn't priced in last quarter is definitely being priced in now. Trace this forward another 6 months, and the diversification capex shows up on a hyperscaler balance sheet as a line item. Shifting away again, let's talk again about Bill Winters, the CEO of Standard Chartered, because earlier this week, he announced a plan to eliminate about 15% of the bank's more than 52,000 back-office roles by 2030. That's roughly 7,800 jobs concentrated in Chennai, Bengaluru, Kuala Lumpur, and Warsaw. He said this, "It's not cost-cutting, it's replacing, in some cases, lower-value human capital with the financial capital and the investment capital we're putting in." That's a quote. Lower value human capital, about 7,800 people. Now, obviously, the backlash ran fast on this, and Winters posted a clarification on LinkedIn just a few hours later. Commenters pushed back hard, and a few hours after that, he posted an apology, acknowledging the phrasing had caused upset and released the full transcript of his remarks as context. But the transcript confirmed he had said exactly what was being quoted. The correction is the most legible part of this story. The original language was the vocabulary the institution had probably internalized for how it talks to itself about the workers it's replacing, and inside the rooms where the strategy got made, that phrase apparently moves without friction. But when it crossed into the public record at a podium, it had to be managed within 24 hours. A day earlier, The Guardian published a parallel story about WiseTech, the Australian logistics firm. WiseTech named AI as the reason for its 2,000 layoffs in English language termination notices. The Chinese language version of the same notice omitted AI entirely. You might remember, if you've been paying attention on the Century Report, that China has been cracking down on AI-specific language when it comes to termination of jobs. 2 jurisdictions, 2 narratives, 1 round of cuts. The same kind of vocabulary curation just made visible across geographies instead of just inside a single news cycle. So what changes when extractive vocabulary becomes a commercial liability? That is the layer at which this restructuring is getting contested. The cuts themselves are going to proceed. Standard Chartered is still eliminating those 7,800 roles. WiseTech is still doing the 2,000. But the framing around the cuts is now publicly contestable at the executive level. And the next CEO announcing comparable cuts will draft remarks for an audience that already had both versions in hand. If you have ever sat through a corporate restructuring announcement and felt the wording was being carefully managed, then what is happening this week is that the management of that wording, it's getting harder. The interior vocabulary of how institutions talk about labor displacement is becoming a public document the same week the displacement decisions get announced. The cost of extractive language is being internalized inside executive communications teams. The next round of cuts will be framed by people who watched this round get framed badly. All right, let's bring it all to a close today. Here's what is worth carrying. The infrastructure of the AI era includes the chips and the racks and the models everyone talks about. It also includes the institutional fabric being woven around all of it. The labor market at the substrate, the records frameworks holding the forensic evidence, the safety hiring done against capability that hasn't shipped yet, the routing decisions that keep the data moving between continents, the vocabulary that executives can and cannot use in public about the workers being asked to leave. The fabric is being assembled week by week by the people closest to each piece of the work, and the assembly is on the public record almost as fast as the decisions happen. If you have been waiting for a single coherent map of how this transition gets governed, the construction is distributed. It's in progress, and the people doing the work are nearer to it than any forecast or framework could have captured. The era arriving needs frameworks that the prior era did not build, and every line we covered today is one more piece of that framework being put into place. You're inside the build. That's where the work is being done, and it's being done right in front of you in public where you can watch it. We'll see you tomorrow.